Hello and welcome. I'm Jared Bernstein, the host of jaredbernsteinblog.com. And I'm very fortunate to have my good old friend Dean Baker here, a longtime Washington, D.C. Economist, to talk about a book he wrote a few months ago, one that I read cover to cover with great interest, called The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive. And I wanted to just have a conversation with Dean about some of the key themes of the book. If you could start out by just kind of briefly summarizing, that would be a great place to start.
Well, the basic point that I try and make in the book is that I think people have really misconceived politics and the market, and particularly I'd say, the conventional liberal view. Usually it's posed that we have conservatives who like the free market, often called free market fundamentalists. On the other hand, we have liberals, progressives who don't necessarily like market outcomes, want the government to intervene to help out the people that don't do so well. And I call that loser liberalism because the idea there is that somehow we just had these natural outcomes. Some people, you had your Bill Gateses do very rich, and then we have a lot of people that don't do so well, and because we feel bad about it, we want to redistribute from the winners to the losers.
And we, in this case, are the liberals.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what I say is, well, yes, we might feel badly about that, but it isn't something that just happened. Basically, that they rigged the deck. So it wasn't just that the market turned out this way. They structured the market to redistribute income upwards. And what I focus on is saying, rather than trying to have progressive taxation, which I think is fine and good, I'm all for that, and having programs, safety net programs, all for that. But the main thing is to deal with the before tax income. Let's on-rig the market so that income flows to everyone rather than just the Bill Gateses of the world.
Okay, great. So let's unpack that a little bit. The idea is that if you're kind of a conservative, then you're all about the free market doing its thing, no government intervention, and it's a meritocracy. If you're smart enough, innovative enough, you'll float to the top. If you're not, you'll float to the bottom, and maybe we'll help you a little bit, maybe we won't. If you're a liberal, you accept all of that, but you try to help the people who have done poorly. And I think what you do, I think extremely effectively in the book, is you show just what a wrong framework that is, because the so-called market fundamental approach isn't laissez-faire at all. There are numerous deep interventions that belie that sort of a claim. So take us through the most important ones, the ways in which the market is rigged, as you said.
Well, I'll just take a few that have been in the news. One that's been in the news and big time lately, of course, the too big to fail banks. So here you have some of the very richest people in the country, the people who are getting the high salaries at Goldman Sachs, Citigroup. Their banks are out of business, absent government support. Now, there's an argument for that. I mean, I understand the argument for the bailouts. I'm sympathetic to that because, it was better for us the financial system didn't collapse. But the point was that wasn't the free market. So you have a lot of people that walked away with tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in their pocket who would have been out on the street had it not been for government intervention.
Okay, so let me push back a little bit on that, just to an obvious argument. I'm not saying I disagree, but so that's kind of a 100-year flood sort of thing. We were in this massive credit contraction having to do with a housing bubble that you identified long ago. Is that something we should be looking at as a one-time sort of thing, or are these things much more?
No, because the whole point here is you have too big to fail banks. It's basically insurance. It's always there. So it's as though the analogy I make is suppose that I was running a fireworks factory out of my house and I have residential mortgage insurance. Well, it doesn't cost me a lot to have home insurance. On the other hand, if they knew I had a fireworks factory, of course I'd be paying a lot more money. So in effect, these guys are running fireworks factory and they're paying, the residential mortgage insurance policy.
So they have actually a deep implicit subsidy.
Exactly, exactly. So that's one example.
Okay, that's one example. Give me another one.
Another one that's really huge that people should think about, and they don't. Drug patents. We pay about $300 billion a year for prescription drugs. If drugs were sold in a free market, we didn't have patents, we'd pay about $30 billion. The difference there is $270 billion. To put that in context, that's about 5 times the Bush tax cuts for the top 2% that we're fighting over.
So all this argumentation about the Bush tax cuts, if we had our heads on straight, we'd be arguing about drug patents. But what about the idea that if you don't provide patents, then innovators won't innovate?
Well, it's important to understand this is one way to support innovation. And there are other ways. We already spend $30 billion a year through the National Institutes of Health to finance biomedical research. So I always say this to people, and they go, well, who's going to do research? I go, well, we actually already pay for a lot.
Well, wait a second. So we're paying $30 billion a year to incentivize, taxpayers are paying for all this research, and then private companies are getting patents on top of that.
Exactly. and what's really
So
funny...
that does sound a touch rigged.
What's really funny is, you have all these people saying, well, the government can't do anything. I go, well, then you want to get rid of that $30 billion. Well, the drug industry is actually the biggest supporter of it for exactly that reason. They benefit from it enormously.
Okay, one more thing, and then we'll end. But talk about the dollar, because that was another kind of a... I thought that was another important dimension of your story.
Yeah, people don't appreciate how important the dollar is, the value of the dollar relative to other currencies.
So this is the value of the dollar in international markets. Okay.
So we have all these arguments about we're going to promote international trade. President Obama or Commerce Secretary, whoever, they're going to go to China or India or wherever it might be and tell them, oh, you should buy more of our goods. Export, right. And that's all well and good. But if you think about, suppose the dollar fell by 20% against the Chinese currency, the Indian currencies, other currencies, that's the same thing as suddenly giving a 20% subsidy to our exports, putting a 20% tariff on our imports. Or to put the other way around, because the dollar is 20% overvalued, it's as though we're subsidizing imports from those countries.
Who says it's overvalued?
Well, the trade deficit says it's overvalued. We have a huge trade deficit, and the system of floating exchange rates like what we have, what's supposed to correct a trade deficit is the dollar's supposed to fall. The reason why that doesn't happen is other countries, their governments, are quite deliberately buying up dollars to keep down the value of their currency against the U.S. dollar.
So this is, for example, Chinese currency management, as it's often discussed.
Exactly. China's, of course, the biggest one, but they're not the only one.
So what is it that, I mean, kind of in your story, there's somehow conservatives are, making this happen with the dollar. I mean, how does that work on the ground?
Well, on the ground, very practically, this problem really came about in a big way in 1997, the East Asian financial bailout. Part of that story was we told the countries of East Asia that you're going to pay your debts, but we're going to let you export to the U.S. Their currencies fell through the floor. And that started a pattern where developing countries in general said we have to accumulate large amounts of reserves so we don't get up in that situation. And what that meant was they kept their currencies very low against the dollar. And that's really the origin of our large trade deficit. We had trade deficits through the 90s. I remember we thought those were bad back in 95, 96. But those were about 1% GDP.
Yeah,
Today we're looking at 4, 5, 6% GDP.
Yeah.
They totally exploded following the East Asian financial bailout.
I see. So a true progressive solution to something like this would be what?
That we say we got to get the dollar down, and this is a process of negotiation. We do talk to China about it. China has raised the value of their currency, but we have to say this is #1 priority. There's all these issues we raised with China about our patents, our copyrights, access for Goldman Sachs to their markets. We got to say all that's fine. This is #1 priority.
Here's one reason I kind of wanted to end there, and I like that because I think what we're talking about here, see if you agree, Dean, is folks like you and me who are often associated with progressive economics, fairly, are here arguing for free market economics. We're saying the dollar's value ought to be set in international markets, not by people managing currency so they can get an advantage on their exports or block somebody else's imports.
Exactly.
So here we're trying to be good free market economists here. So it's a good example of I think your thematic.
Exactly. Well, I've been around enough of the free market economists. I've listened to them enough that there is a logic there, and the point is it doesn't always end up where they try and tell us it ends up, and that's where we make a mistake if we let them say, oh, that's the end of the story, because most often it's not.
Thank you. Well said. Thanks for listening, and Dean Baker, we'll get you back soon to talk further about this.
Thanks for having me on.